let's start. It's the summer of 1972. You are you have toppled a senior leader of the Democratic congressional leadership. You're running for office. The Watergate break-in takes place. You're very busy running for office. Do you notice it at all?
Just barely. Actually, the irony is that there was a break-in in my own campaign headquarters roughly around that time, and a very ugly incident. People actually got beat up and had to get taken to the hospital. So I was worried about my own campaign and worried about my own campaign workers and worried about the break-in at my campaign headquarters. So Watergate was just kind of far in the distance, thunder far in the distance.
You get elected?
I won the primary. That was in Brooklyn, the equivalent of getting elected, although my opponent challenged my election in the courts, but when that was over and I won in the courts, then, of course, it was a November election, but it was not. It was pro forma.
What kind of training did they have for new Congress people?
None.
None?
None.
You get to Washington. What are your assignments?
Well, I didn't get to Washington day one of the new Congress. I understood that you had to go and select a committee and be on a committee, and so I sat around with my advisors, and just to give you an idea of how remote the idea of impeachment was. I mean, not only remote, non-existent. We sat around and tried to figure out what would be the best committee to be on. And we all agreed that since my predecessor had been on the House Judiciary Committee for 50 years, that it'd probably be a good idea to break new ground and try something different so I wouldn't be compared to him and try to get on another committee. So I went down to Washington to lobby not to be put on the Judiciary Committee. In those days, freshman members of Congress weren't listened to. So I came down. I remember going to see, in those days, the Ways and Means Committee made the decisions. The Democrats for the Democrats, the Republican members of the committee for the Republican newly elected members of Congress. And so I went down and visited all the members of the Ways and Means Committee, and it didn't do me any good. My predecessor had been on the House Judiciary Committee. He vacated that seat. That seat was empty. I was a lawyer. They were putting me on it no matter what. So I was actually quite crestfallen when my first venture down to Washington was such an utter failure. I said, oh, this is not an auspicious beginning. And so I was very disappointed that I was on the House Judiciary Committee, and I was a little concerned that the other members who had served with my predecessor would somehow be hostile to me, but none of that turned out to be true.
So you thought it would be a backwater?
I did. Not only a backwater. I wasn't sure it would be a backwater, but I certainly didn't think it was going to be a front water. Let's put it that way. That was, And I'll tell you something else. They never would have put me on the House Judiciary Committee if they had any inkling, the members of very important and very senior and very experienced members, Democratic members of the Ways and Means Committee, including Wilbur Mills. They never would have put me on the House Judiciary Committee if they had any idea that impeachment would be taking place. So we're talking already after the Nixon landslide in November, the November election. This is sometime towards the end of November, beginning of December of 1972. It just shows how how non-existent the idea of impeachment was and how successful the cover-up had been.